My first question is identity question. As you already know, our organization is really interesting in identity, especially the diasporic identity or the Chinese identity. But as you also indicated in our preliminary meetings, that you have concerns about being classified as a Chinese diaspora artist, which really made me think of the non-fixated process of human identity proposed by Stuart Hall. I'm really curious about what your concern is specifically about and where it comes from, and how do you see the role of identity, even like a fluid one, in your own works and life?
When you first invited me, I expressed my reservations of being described as Chinese diaspora, but I guess you can also say the whole crisis is in Singapore's own identity. Firstly, there's no denying that the education I've had in Singapore was very westernized. And also, when I lived abroad, I lived in London, Paris, and Berlin. If I be more specific, that flavor of my westernization is pretty European. If you study English Lit in Singapore, that actually translates to mean is that you would have studied British literature, specifically from 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century. After reading so much British literature in particular, it meant that when I went to London, it was almost like visiting somewhere I had always seen in the books. It was like, oh, just returning to somewhere from memory. But on the other hand, when I went to Beijing for the first time, it was like being in a completely alien place I didn't know anything about because I didn't read any Chinese literature growing up. We don't read Chinese literature in school even. Despite the fact that Singapore is, although we say it's multicultural, it's like 70% Chinese actually. Artists and people here always have some crisis. Oh, what is Singapore? What does it mean to be Singaporean? Is it lacking in character or creativity? Even in some of the things that define Singapore, for example, there is this idea of people's identity being Peranakan, which is kind of a hybrid between the Malay and the Chinese cultures here. So people will say, oh, what is the basis for separating this out from it? Is it truly something that is unique? So there are a lot of debates on what constitutes Singapore identity.
I think it's a very interesting topic here to Singaporean identity, also in relation to the artist's identity here. My second question goes from identity to the broader topic of diaspora. Second question is about data and diaspora, a concept of relationship. I tentatively, but also very cautiously draw from our school conversations, also from your Friday PowerPoint about your VR works, which you curiously mentioned the ideas of journey or cyclescape and also Baudelaire's flaneur. So in this very intentional linkage between data and diaspora I put in here, I identify a shared discursive character of both data and diaspora, whereas data seems to have played a more empirical and extraneous role, whereas diaspora is more about subjectivity and internality, but certainly conditioned by externality. So in our culture, I think computer data is produced through the binary system that's highly organized and rationalized by origin. Yet the presentation and dissemination of it, its production and reproduction network, is far more complex, chaotic, and contingent, which is almost analogous to diasporic identity. Hence, in my understanding, we have all been rendered nomadic and flaneur-ish in the discursive map of data, representing the virtual world and diaspora representing the physical world. However, my only concern with the French flaneur is that it's not only discursive, but also is very distant, assuming the transparent and subjective position in entering and wandering in the realm of the passive objects, thus revealing the power dynamics here. So by contrast, the digital flaneur might be able to keep some distance by virtue of the light speed signals. But by the end of the day, we're also very inevitably implicated in the power dynamics instead of remaining as the aloof, the cool artistic, the pensive bohemian of the 19th century Montmartre Paris. In this sense, data is not merely objective and the diaspora is not purely objective or subjective, but both entail creative or administrative participation in the data drifts, enabling the other sense of diaspora, performativity, and the looming susceptibility of this journey to more unpredictable forces and the power panopticization, I would say, this process of becoming panopticon in the surveillance and information capitalism, they would say. And also circling back to your sharing here, there's a very interesting point that stood out to me, which is your work is not only purely about the virtual construction of a landscape or idea, but you have this dual character or dual identity of being tactile on the one hand, You would produce a 3D printed object for people to feel. I think feeling the object is a very important aspect of your work, which really surprised me. And the other is you also created this kind of virtual world for people to get into with all the technical gadgets. So I think that also connect the dual worlds of digital and physical, the dual worlds of urbanscape and cyclescape. So I will ask you about your specific understanding of being or against being a digital planner and your own experience of traversing the dual worlds of the digital and physical and urbanscape and cyclescape.
I guess I'll start with what you mentioned about being a digital flaneur. I always used to say that my work had been influenced greatly by psychogeography. I suppose I rarely had to explain my interest in psychogeography when I was living for many years in London, where it seems to be part of the literature and the arts there. As you did point out, it is very French, very Marxist, very white male, but I also think that there is still a lot of creative possibilities from the kind of techniques that are kind of outlined, thinking about space, thinking about cities on a more emotional level, on a more literary level, a more poetic level than the way we usually experience it. I also think that there are still ways to use those ideas without only being specific to the very French and the very Marxist, strictly readings of it. The second part, thinking about how we perform Singapore identity, it's also worth noting that Singapore is super tiny. Just a city is actually quite myopic in itself because it's small. Even like in the art scene, it's like a very small country. I always feel like every few years, every few months, probably in the news, there will be lots of concern about what does it mean to be Singapore and the concerns about new citizens because Singapore is also always growing. It has lots of migrants from other countries, specifically from China and also from India migrating to Singapore. So in politics and the news, you always see this discussion keeps arising because there's a delicate balancing act to defining the history or even the identity of Singapore. I think a lot of the spaces you would see in Singapore, due to its kind of very utilitarian urban planning, especially in malls, in even some of the public buildings here, they look like they could be anywhere in the world. If they're older than they were built in the 70s, it's common for them to be demolished and rebuilt. There is also this en bloc sale fever where all the owners in the plot of land on an apartment block will sell their land collectively to developers, even though the building is pretty good, even historically important. This very commonly happens. As a result, you almost feel like there isn't time to get lost. There's no room to get lost in also. Even in terms of thinking of art, I think during the COVID, the main papers here, the Straits Times, published this controversial infographic on the non-essential occupations that people should switch out of during COVID. And artist was the first one in this article that this infographic they showed. It always arises the question, is there time and room for art as well? Are there still opportunities for escape in a city like this? For myself on the personal level, whenever I travel or in my experience of having lived in other cities for a few years, I fear that Singapore will change beyond recognition. Even all the places from my childhood, my primary school, my junior college, my university, all the buildings, all gone or changed. All these areas within your lifetime, for a lot of people, they have almost no physical space to hold on to. Maybe that's also what inspires me to make work about urban space as well, because it's something that you almost cannot hold on to in Singapore.
Following your response to this question also made me think of why you would prefer or venture into the virtual realms. I would think maybe the sort of constant tension between the public and the private, or the constant convergence of the public and private in such an island city. So that's my own thoughts here. I also want to point out my key observations of some of your works that really stood out to me. I think that not finding other artists easily. There's a work you presented, it's called The Void, but you said something about a cave. This just stood out to me interesting because I was thinking about the Platonic cave, how people would emerge from the realistic shadows of their own imagination from the Platonic cave and finally see the sun, the metaphor for the reality. And secondly, is the baby face. Is that face of your daughter?
Yes.
That's very interesting. It's very surreal as well because you're collecting faces, collecting all those different expressions almost as some kind of prizes in a game. I also found the sound effects are also a very important part of your work as well. And Void also, I think you just mentioned very interesting name as well, because I would never think of the virtual world as a void, but you also mentioned how Singapore is sort of metaphorically a black hole of meaning, or a black hole for assigning new meanings. So I think that's the connection over there. And this voidness is something also curious because when you think about a virtual world, it's just a bunch of data sets and websites. but you would think of what actually it comprises of. There's something definitely, I think, physical and more substantial to it as we are having this very intensified engagement with it and almost having our lives organized by it. And the third point really stood out is your interest in data sets. You're almost using these data sets as raw materials. Constantly, I feel like data sets as a material is very malleable, very resourceful, even like very lively and dynamic information, but also creativity for you. So you're constantly morphing these data sets into new meanings. To me, that almost like complicating this identity of all these data sets. As you mentioned, they're like commodities, but at the same time, they can be like sort of neutral point of information, as you mentioned about like the shipwreck and all this plant and animal data, which made us really question the identity of these data sets as commodities. And you're doing, I think it's almost like a decommodification of these data sets and make them take on like artwork and really make me think of what is the essence of these objects originally on this data sets. And also the embedding process is the fourth point I want to point it out. This embedding process is also very interesting. Really made me think of this analogous process of identity reproduction. Because while you're embedding this like another painting or the characteristic of another painting into the alpaca, I think that there's a transcoding of the two stuff. And it's really difficult to tell what is the background, what is the foreground, what is the subject, what is the object. So here you use machine learning to really expand and accelerate that process. And the last point I want to point out is your interest and in your investment in this process called categorization. In this process of categorization, this is where I see eventually the artist's voice comes out and almost like new kind of God trying to rearrange the formal order of the mundane life, but more kind of aesthetic and contingent. You cannot tell what this object should go to this categorization or that one, but it's all kind of artist choice. So it's almost like a game. And you using all this virtual technology only to expand and strengthen this capacity and identity of the artist. My final question is about your choice of medium. I think what made me think of and wonder is that what made you interested in choosing new media as the main medium? On the other hand, I also see that your work are very metaphorical, very historical, and very literally, or at least literally influenced. Although I think you are consciously trying to evade all these labels, but I think there are some connections throughout your works. So my final questions are just about your thoughts on these two aspects. Thank you.
So I guess to respond to that, talking about my choice of medium, right? And also maybe to point out the relationship between design and art, since I have also previously worked as a designer and for quite a number of years as a design educator specifically. I use a lot of design skills to produce art. I suppose that the difference between design and art that I see is that design is about closing that gap. When we talk about making an art, I think of it as a translation. There is always this bridge that you have to make in terms of the communication. For example, the example of the scallop. What people think a scallop is may not be what you thought the scallop looked like. So in design, the gap doesn't exist anymore because design will close it totally. But I think in art, it's saying that the gap will always exist. There's no way to bridge it. So we talk about the ways that we understand it. I think you could say also on a practical level that I chose to practice also in design as a complementary discipline because it's very hard to exist maybe in Singapore as a contemporary artist. The arts relies heavily on government funding, which comes with its own issues. For example, there was the obscenity trial regarding performance art in the 90s, which resulted in performance art being banned for quite a number of years in the 90s. And to this day, that's always been a concern of exactly what art is permitted. And also in the general sense, you feel that the audiences may not have enough exposure to understand art, like sound art was being introduced here a few years ago. But it was so new that even to today, I think it's very hard for a Singaporean audience to appreciate sound art without a visual. You have to explain, even new media art, is it even art? I keep being asked all the time. It's always been a struggle to exist as a full-time artist as well. So you also find that many teaching art, I really love teaching art, but then I also didn't want to give students the misunderstanding that it was easy to be a full-time artist in Singapore. On the contrary, it can be quite a struggle to exist. So for me, obviously having spent so much time doing design as well, that's also incorporated into the work that I make. The next part is, I think, Mohammed, you were talking about the data sets that I like to use in the work. In categorization, I always see this using of data as a kind of translation, like writing a poem. When you write the words, choose the words of the writer, you also decide not to put in a lot of the words. And the technology is not magic because I guess the big data is useless unless the humans have interpreted it and have found what's the meaning in it. So I think of it as the interpretation is open, and it's making a work about this is also an invitation to the audience to have a conversation about their interpretations to things. I think maybe to tie it also to the virtual realm as well. I guess my dream is to bring the audience into that experience, because haven't you ever woken from a dream and then you felt inspired because you were flying through the most amazing dream space and it was like limitless, or it feels like you could lucid dream, control the whole environment? And I guess the virtual world is a way to bring that to life in a very, I would say, low-cost way, also on the practical level again, compared to building a bunker, which I have built before, a life-size sculptures before, which took very long and very, very costly. It was like, bing, I can build you a virtual world and I can bring you there now. It made it faster for me to make a lot of these ideas real.
I think being an artist isn't easy anywhere. I think that's a very realistic problem we all have to face here. There's also many members of and audiences of our organization, full-time or part-time artists. So I think they will understand this pretty well. I think a lot of your points really made me think about broad relationship between humanity and technology, especially in art scene. And I would say in the Singaporean art scene, especially where the government on the one hand is pushing really hard the promotion of new media art, sometimes as a tourist spectacles. But on the other hand, we are also trying to use it as a very effective vehicle for carrying our ideas and or affecting some like social changes. That's realistic problem that we all have to face either as artists or as Asians to make art, and especially making media art in Asian context can be really unique and really susceptible to a lot of new conditions.